Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. Wherever you are tonight, whether you are settled beneath heavy blankets with the rain against the window, or lying in a quiet room with the day finally behind you, we are glad you are here. Tonight's story is a long one, a full life told slowly, the kind of story you can follow into sleep and let carry you somewhere calm. Before we begin, you are welcome to leave a quiet comment below. Just a word or two about where in the world you are listening from tonight, or the name of a historical figure you would like to spend an evening with next. And if these stories help you rest, subscribing is a gentle way to help more people find them. Now, let us settle in. There is a particular kind of life that does not announce itself as remarkable from the outside. No single dramatic discovery, no revolution led from a barricade, no exile, no triumphant return. And yet, when you sit down and follow that life carefully from its beginning to its end, something unexpected reveals itself. A quietness that turns out to be its own kind of depth. Marcus Aurelius was, by almost every external measure, one of the most powerful men of the ancient world. He ruled an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast of what is now Portugal to the edges of Mesopotamia. Millions of people lived and died beneath the authority of his name. Armies marched on his orders. Cities sought his judgment. Emperors before him had built monuments, started wars, demanded temples in their honor. Marcus Aurelius did something stranger. He kept a private journal, not for publication, not for posterity, for himself. A record of failures, of struggles, of small daily attempts to be better than he had been the day before. He wrote about losing his temper and regretting it, about the difficulty of waking up in the morning, about the constant effort to act with patience and reason when the world, his world, an empire under pressure on every frontier, kept pulling at him in every direction at once. That journal survived. We still have it. And that is the quiet paradox at the center of this story. The man who held more power than almost anyone in the ancient world left behind not a record of conquest, but a record of doubt. What does it mean to be the most powerful person alive and spend your evenings writing reminders to yourself to be humble? That is the question this life keeps asking. Marcus Aurelius was born in the year 121 of the Common Era, in the city of Rome. The Rome into which he arrived was, in that particular decade, at something close to its fullest expansion. The empire was enormous, prosperous in many of its provinces, and governed, for a stretch that later historians would look back on with a kind of wistfulness, by a sequence of capable rulers. The philosopher Edward Gibbon, writing many centuries later, would describe this period as one of the happiest the human race had experienced. That is, of course, a complicated claim, but the point it gestures toward is real. The Roman world of Marcus Aurelius's birth was not in obvious crisis. It was, to the eye of the time, stable. He was born into a family of Spanish origin, wealthy and well-connected, with roots in the Roman senatorial class. His father's name was Marcus Annius Verus. His mother was Domitia Lucilla, a woman of considerable wealth, and by the accounts we have, considerable intelligence. The family owned brickyards outside Rome. This was not a minor enterprise. The construction of Rome, its apartment buildings, its public baths, its walls and floors and courtyards, depended on vast quantities of brick. The stamped marks of the family's kilns have been found on bricks across the city. Marcus was the middle link in a chain of men who shared his name. His grandfather, also named Marcus Annius Verus, had served as a senator and a consul, and was, when the boy was born, still alive and influential in Rome. His father, the younger Marcus Annius Verus, died when the boy was only 3 years old. The details we have are few. What we know is simply this: that Marcus grew up without his father, raised largely in the household of his grandfather, and later under the close attention of his mother. His mother Lucilla is a presence worth pausing on. She appears throughout the early sections of Marcus's life as a steady, serious influence. In the journal he kept as an adult, he would reflect on what he had inherited from the people around him in childhood, and his words about her are specific. He credited her with teaching him simplicity of living, generosity, and the avoidance of excessive luxury. These were not abstract virtues for Marcus. They were habits. Habits formed in childhood, in rooms that, despite the family's wealth, were kept without extravagance. The house would have been one of those elegant but functional Roman homes. A central courtyard open to the sky, rooms arranged around it, light falling at particular angles through the day. The sounds of the street, vendors, cartwheels on stone, voices calling across alleyways, filtered in from outside, softened by walls and distance. Inside, the household kept its own rhythms: meals at regular hours, study in the mornings, the management of accounts and correspondence, and the social obligations that came with a family of their position. Marcus was educated at home, as was customary for children of his class. He had tutors, several of them. The ancient sources name a number of these men, and it is clear that his education was taken seriously from an early age. He studied Greek literature and Latin rhetoric. He practiced physical training in the Roman fashion: wrestling, riding, hunting. He was, by the accounts that survive, a serious child, not somber exactly, but attentive, careful. Already it seems the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. Something happened when Marcus was around 12 years old that would shape the rest of his life in ways he could not have imagined at the time. He encountered philosophy, not as a school subject, not as something assigned by a tutor, but as something that struck him, apparently, with the force of a genuine discovery. The philosophy that captured him was Stoicism. It was already an old tradition by the time it reached the boy Marcus, founded in Athens several centuries before, carried forward through generations of teachers, debated and refined and adapted as it traveled through the Greek-speaking world and into Rome. By Marcus's time, it had become perhaps the most respected philosophical tradition among serious Romans. It offered something practical, not just abstract ideas about the nature of reality, but a guide to living, a set of principles for how to behave, how to think, how to respond to difficulty, how to hold yourself together when the world became chaotic or painful or unfair. The Stoics believed, at the center of their teaching, that the only things truly in our control are our own judgments and our own responses. Not what happens to us, not what other people do, not the weather or the political situation or the length of a life, only what we choose to think and what we choose to do in response to thinking it. This idea, simple to state, genuinely difficult to live, would become the central project of Marcus Aurelius's entire adult existence. He threw himself into it with a kind of passion that surprised even those around him. He began sleeping on the floor, Rather than in a comfortable bed, he wore rough clothing. He adopted, as best a wealthy Roman boy could manage, the habits of simple living that Stoic teachers recommended. His mother, by the accounts we have, was patient with this phase. Perhaps she recognized something real in it, or perhaps she simply understood that a child who was passionate about philosophy was unlikely to become a serious problem. One of his early teachers in this direction was a man named Diognetus, to whom Marcus later credited his introduction to philosophical discipline. There were others, but it was in his teenage years that the more significant figures arrived, men whose influence would stay with him for decades. And then, when Marcus was around 17 years old, something happened that had nothing to do with philosophy, something entirely outside his control, something that would alter the entire course of his life. The Emperor of Rome, a man named Hadrian, aging and without a natural heir, began to arrange the future of the empire. And in that arrangement, in ways that must have seemed almost impossible to believe, the name of the young Marcus Annius Verus appeared. The world did not yet know what this meant, and neither perhaps did Marcus himself. Hadrian was not a simple man to read. He was cultured, well-traveled, a lover of Greek art and architecture, who had spent years touring the provinces of his empire rather than sitting in Rome behind closed doors. He had rebuilt cities, commissioned temples, left his name on monuments across the ancient world. He was also, by the time he began thinking seriously about succession, in poor health and aware of it. The question of who would follow him was not an abstract political problem. It was urgent. His first choice had been a man named Lucius Aelius Caesar, whom he adopted and designated as his successor. But Lucius Aelius died early, before Hadrian, leaving the question open again. What followed was a careful, deliberate arrangement, the kind that only an emperor could manage. Hadrian chose a senator named Antoninus, a man of proven steadiness and good reputation, and required him, as a condition of his own adoption, to adopt two young men in turn. One of them was the 7-year-old son of the late Lucius Aelius. The other was Marcus. Marcus was not yet 18. He had been living the life of a well-connected Roman youth, serious, studious, moving through his education with a focus that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. And then, without having sought it, without any action on his part that could have predicted it, he was drawn into the direct line of imperial succession. He became, in the careful legal language of Roman adoption, the son of the future emperor. When Hadrian died in 138 and Antoninus took the throne, Marcus moved closer still. He was betrothed to Antoninus's daughter. He was given official titles. He was included in public ceremonies, brought into the business of governing, made visible to the city and the empire as the man who would one day follow. He was, in a word, chosen. And he had not chosen it. This is a detail that the later Marcus, the one writing in his journal during the cold campaigns on the Danube frontier, returned to in his own way. He was careful not to complain. Stoicism did not permit complaint as a philosophy of life. But he wrote, more than once, about the difference between what a person seeks and what a person receives, about accepting the role you are given without resentment, about finding, within the circumstances you did not choose, the work that is genuinely yours to do. whether he struggled with the weight of that early designation, whether the boy who had been falling asleep on a hard floor by philosophical conviction found the gilded corridors of the imperial household difficult to reconcile with his chosen values, we cannot say with certainty. But the tension was there. It would always be there. And it is one of the things that makes this life so worth following. The years between Marcus's adoption and his eventual accession to the throne were long ones. Antoninus reigned for more than 2 decades, a reign so stable, so quietly competent, that later generations would struggle to find much to say about it, which is in its own way a form of praise. Rome was not in crisis. The frontiers held. The provinces were administered. Antoninus governed from Rome, preferred negotiation to war, and cultivated a reputation for fairness and consistency that made him deeply respected, if not dramatically remembered. Marcus was at his side through much of this. He served in official capacities. He learned the machinery of imperial administration, the correspondence, the petitions, the appointments, the endless flow of decisions that an empire of that scale required. He sat in on deliberations. He watched how power actually worked, up close, over years. And he continued, in whatever hours remained, to study philosophy. His primary teacher during these years was a man named Fronto, one of the most celebrated rhetoricians in Rome. Fronto was not a Stoic. He was a master of Latin style, of the carefully constructed argument, of the persuasive public address. He and Marcus exchanged letters, many of which survive. And what those letters reveal is a relationship of genuine warmth. Fronto teased his young student. Marcus teased back. There was affection there, and real intellectual engagement. Marcus learned from Fronto how to write with precision, how to choose words carefully, how to shape a sentence so that it carried exactly the weight he intended. But the teacher who shaped him most deeply was not Fronto. It was a man named Epictetus, or rather, not the man himself, who had died some years before Marcus was born, but his recorded teachings. Epictetus had been a Greek slave who became a Stoic philosopher of the first order. He had never written anything himself. His teachings survived because a student had written them down, and those written records had circulated and been read and discussed for generations. Marcus encountered them, was gripped by them, and returned to them throughout his life. There is something in that particular connection worth noticing. The future emperor of Rome, one of the most powerful men alive, studying the words of a man who had been enslaved. Both of them committed to the same central question: how do you live well, regardless of your circumstances? How do you remain yourself when the world applies its pressures? For Epictetus, the pressure had been bondage, poverty, physical hardship. For Marcus, it would be power, responsibility, and the weight of an empire. The philosophical answer was the same. Focus on what you can control. Release what you cannot. Do your duty without illusion. The private years of Marcus's philosophical education were not idle years, but they were, in a meaningful sense, quiet ones. He was preparing without fully knowing what he was preparing for. He was forming the habits of mind, the daily practice of self-examination, the steady return to principle that would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. Sometime in his early 30s, Marcus married Faustina, the daughter of Antoninus. She would be his wife for more than 30 years, and their marriage would produce a large number of children. Sources vary on the precise count, but many of them died young, as was heartbreakingly common in that world. The grief of those losses is not something Marcus ever narrated at length in his surviving writing, but it surfaces, quietly, in the way he wrote about impermanence, about holding the people you love with open hands, about not demanding of the world that it keep what it has given you. Faustina herself is a figure history has treated inconsistently. Some ancient sources were unkind to her, as ancient sources so often were to the women at the edges of powerful men. Later accounts tried to rehabilitate her reputation. What the evidence most honestly suggests is this: that the marriage was long, that Marcus was devoted to her, and that her death, which came years before his own, was a genuine blow. He arranged for her to be honored after her death in ways that went beyond the merely ceremonial. That is not the behavior of a man performing a duty. It is the behavior of a man who had loved someone. Their household was a full one, shaped by the rhythms of Roman aristocratic life, the formal meals, the managed public appearances, the private hours that were always fewer than one might wish. Marcus rose early. He was known for this. He wrote, in the journal he kept, about the difficulty of getting out of bed in the cold morning, about the small internal argument between comfort and duty that had to be won, freshly, each day. There is something almost disarming in that admission. The Emperor of Rome, lying in the dark, bargaining with himself to get up. In 161, Antoninus died. He had reigned for 23 years, and he died as he had governed, without drama, of natural causes, in his 70s. Marcus was 40 years old. He'd been preparing for this moment, in one sense, for more than 2 decades. He'd been watching, learning, waiting, and now the throne was his. He did something almost immediately that no one had required him to do, and that surprised at least some of those around him. He insisted that his co-emperor, the other young man who had been adopted alongside him years before, Lucius Verus, the son of the late Lucius Aelius, be given equal official status, not a subordinate role, not an honorary title, a genuine share of imperial power. This had never quite been done in the same way before. The reasons Marcus gave, or that later writers attributed to him, were practical in part. The empire was large. There was already trouble on multiple frontiers. Having 2 emperors meant having 2 men who could be present in different places, 2 sets of hands on the administration. That was true enough. But there was something else in the decision that feels characteristic of Marcus. He did not hoard what he had. He had been given enormous power through no particular merit of his own. He knew this, and he did not seem to believe that holding it jealously made it more legitimate. Lucius Verus was a different kind of man. He was sociable, fond of entertainment, less philosophically inclined, more comfortable with pleasure and celebration than Marcus tended to be. The 2 men were not identical in character, but Marcus, by all the evidence, was genuinely fond of him. He wrote about him with warmth. He mourned him when Lucius died, years later, of illness contracted while on campaign. The first years of Marcus's reign were almost immediately demanding. The trouble that had been gathering on the frontiers arrived. In the east, there was war with Parthia, a conflict that Lucius Verus would go to manage, winning victories that the surviving sources credit partly to his capable generals. In the north, Along the Danube, something more serious and more sustained was beginning to build. The Germanic tribes on the other side of the river were moving, pressing, testing the edges of Roman territory in ways that had not been seen in some time. And then, overlaid on all of this, came the plague. It arrived with the returning armies from the Eastern campaign. It moved through the empire, with the roads and the rivers, following the same routes that commerce and administration followed. It reached the cities, the camps, the countryside. It killed in large numbers, over years. Ancient sources describe it with the kind of spare horror that comes from witnessing something for which there is no adequate language. Streets emptied, households silenced, the ordinary sounds of life interrupted in ways that did not quickly recover. Marcus governed through it. He arranged for grain supplies, for the management of the dead, for the continuation of public functions that the plague threatened to disrupt. He did not retreat, and in the evenings, or in whatever hours the work allowed him, he wrote. The journal, the work we now call the Meditations, was not written in peace. The Meditations were not given that title by Marcus himself. He left no title on them at all. What survives is a private document written in Greek, the language of philosophy, the language of the tradition he had given himself to, across a number of years, most of them during the campaigns on the northern frontier. The manuscript was not organized for an audience. There is no argument being built, no case being made to an outside reader. It reads instead like a man talking to himself, reminding himself, correcting himself, starting over the next morning with the same commitments he had made the morning before. He wrote in short entries. Some are just a few lines. Some extend a little further. They repeat certain themes so often that a reader begins to understand, through the repetition itself, which particular struggles were his. He reminded himself constantly not to be distracted by what others thought of him. He reminded himself that everything passes, fame, pleasure, life itself, and that this was not cause for despair, but for clarity. He reminded himself, again and again, to return to the present moment, to do the work in front of him, to treat the people around him, even the difficult ones, with patience. There is a line he returned to in various forms, across many entries, that stays with almost everyone who reads it. The idea that you could begin again, that each morning was, in a real sense, a new opportunity to be what you had decided to be. Not that yesterday's failures didn't matter, but that they did not have to determine today. This was not optimism in the easy, comfortable sense. It was something harder and more useful, a discipline, a practice, a choice made daily in the full knowledge that it would need to be made again tomorrow. He was not writing for us, but he was, without knowing it, writing something that would outlast everything else connected to his name. The northern frontier, where many of these entries were written, was a landscape entirely unlike Rome. The Danube in those years, cold, wide, moving with a slowness that nonetheless conveyed force, formed the edge between the Roman world and the lands beyond. The camps where Marcus spent so much of his later reign were functional rather than comfortable. Stone and timber, the smell of wood smoke and leather and horses, the sound, constant during active periods, of military organization, men moving, orders called, the particular rhythms of an army, preparing or resting or mourning its losses. In winter, The cold came down hard from the north. The light was thin and grey for long stretches. The ground froze. Supply lines became difficult. Marcus was not a soldier by formation. He had not grown up dreaming of military command. He had grown up reading philosophy and practicing rhetoric and learning the quiet disciplines of the mind. And yet, here he was, in his 50s, spending year after year on the banks of a cold river, managing a war that would not resolve itself quickly, that kept returning even when it seemed to have subsided, that asked of him not brilliance or inspiration, but simple, exhausting endurance. He managed it. He was not, by any account, a military genius. He was something perhaps more valuable in a sustained conflict, reliable. He made decisions carefully. He chose capable subordinates and trusted them. He remained when remaining was hard. And in the spaces between the decisions, he wrote his private notes to himself about what it meant to keep going when keeping going was all that was possible. The war itself, historians call it the Marcomannic War, though it was a series of campaigns rather than a single conflict, was grinding and complex. The tribes pressing against the Danube were not a single unified force. They were multiple groups with different leaders and different pressures driving them. Some were moving because of population shifts further east. Some were taking advantage of the plague-weakened state of the Roman forces. Some had genuine grievances tied to trade and Roman policy along the frontier. Marcus negotiated when he could, fought when he had to, and tried. The evidence suggests he tried genuinely to find terms that would hold rather than simply punish. There were victories. There were also years of setback, of loss, of campaigns that ended without the resolution that had been hoped for. The war outlasted Marcus's strength. It was still ongoing in various forms when he died. And this too is part of the honest shape of this life. It did not end in triumph. The empire he governed so carefully remained, at his death, under pressure. The problems he spent his last years trying to solve were not solved. That is, in the end, what most lives look like, from the inside. Continuous. Unfinished. Still reaching towards something when the reaching stops. But let us not arrive at the end before we have finished the middle, because the middle of Marcus's reign contains much more than war and plague. He continued to govern with a regularity and seriousness that the available evidence makes clear. He spent time in Rome when the campaigns allowed. He heard legal cases personally. An enormous amount of his time and attention was given to the law. Roman emperors of this period served as the final court of appeal for the empire, and Marcus took this role with unusual dedication. He sat through hearings. He deliberated carefully. He extended the time given to each case beyond what convenience might have suggested, because he believed. This comes through in both his personal writing and in the legal decisions that survive, that people deserve to be heard. He made rulings that moved in modest but real ways in the direction of protecting those with less power. Slaves in certain circumstances. Children whose interests were in conflict with those of their guardians. Widows navigating the complicated machinery of Roman inheritance law. He was not a revolutionary. He did not overturn the structures of Roman society, but within those structures, in the individual decisions that came before him, he tried to apply something like genuine fairness rather than simple precedent. His correspondence was extensive. He wrote to governors, to cities sending petitions, to military commanders, to philosophers. He received letters and answered them. He acknowledged the communications of local communities with what the surviving evidence suggests was more personal attention than many emperors had given. A city in Asia Minor, suffering from an earthquake, received a response that went beyond the formulaic. A philosophical community with a particular administrative question received a reply that engaged with the substance of their situation rather than deflecting it to a subordinate. He was also, during these middle years, continuing to shape his own mind through conversation with people he respected. One figure worth pausing on is a teacher named Sextus of Cheronea, a Stoic philosopher to whom Marcus referred in his private writing with deep gratitude. He credited Sextus with modeling something that is harder to describe than it sounds: how to live with seriousness without becoming rigid, how to be genuinely kind without becoming weak, how to combine philosophical commitment with ordinary human warmth. Marcus observed this in Sextus, apparently, not through formal lectures, but through the man's simple daily behavior. The way he moved through a room, the way he spoke to people, the way he responded to difficulty without performance and without collapse. This was the kind of learning Marcus prized most. Not the abstract argument, not the rhetorical demonstration, but the living example. The person who showed, through ordinary actions over ordinary days, what the philosophy actually looked like when it was working. He was surrounded, for much of his life, by people who were trying to use him in one way or another. This is the permanent condition of power. Everyone who approaches has a request, a position to protect, a grievance to settle, a favor to seek. The court around an emperor, then, as in most other periods of history, was a complicated human environment, alliances forming and dissolving, reputations being managed, information being shaped before it reached the man at the center. Marcus was not naive about this. His journal contains observations about flattery, about the dangers of surrounding yourself with people who tell you only what you wish to hear, about the difficulty of knowing who in a room is being genuinely honest. He valued honesty the way a person values something they know is rare. He wrote about it with a kind of longing that suggests it was not always easy to find, even from his closest advisors. His son Commodus was, during the later years of Marcus's reign, a growing presence and a growing concern. Commodus had been born in 161, the same year Marcus became emperor, and was therefore a young man by the time his father was deep into the campaigns on the Danube. Marcus made Commodus his co-emperor, while the young man was still a teenager, a decision that later historians have found difficult to fully explain, given what Commodus would go on to become. The reign of Commodus after Marcus's death was, by almost all surviving accounts, disastrous. He was self-aggrandizing, erratic, prone to cruelty, interested in spectacle over administration. He would eventually be assassinated, after a reign that undid much of what his father had carefully maintained. The contrast between father and son became, in later centuries, one of the sharpest such contrasts in Roman history. The philosopher-emperor and the narcissist. The man who wrote reminders to himself to be humble, and the man who had himself depicted as the hero Hercules. Why Marcus did not choose a different successor, why he did not look, as several of the emperors before him had done, beyond his own bloodline for someone better suited to the role, is a question that admits no entirely satisfying answer. Perhaps he hoped that the qualities he had tried to cultivate in his son would eventually take hold. Perhaps the political realities of dynastic succession, with all the expectations and pressures they carried, left him less freedom than it might appear. Perhaps he simply, in the particular blindness that even careful people can have toward their own children, could not see what others around him may have begun to sense. Whatever the reason, it was a failure. Marcus Aurelius, who wrote so searchingly about wisdom and foresight and the long consequences of choices, made one of the most consequential errors of his reign in the choice he left behind him. He was not exempt from the ordinary human limits he wrote about so honestly. That too is part of the record. The campaigns on the Danube continued into the 170s. There were moments of apparent progress. There were settlements reached with some of the tribal groups, relocations arranged, terms agreed upon that held for a time. And then, in the way that long frontier conflicts so often proceeded, the situation shifted again. New pressures, new negotiations required. The work recommenced. Through all of it, Marcus wrote, there is a passage in the Meditations that reads, in its quiet way, like a confession. Marcus writes about the temptation to retreat, not physically, not to abandon the campaigns or the courts or the correspondence that filled his days, but inwardly, to find, somewhere inside himself, a place that the noise and the pressure and the grief of governing could not reach. He called it, in his own language, the inner citadel, the idea that a person carries within them a space that belongs entirely to themselves, that no external circumstance, however difficult, can enter that space without permission. He returned to this idea often, and the frequency with which he returned to it tells you something. It was not a settled conviction, easily held. It was something he had to keep finding, keep rebuilding. A discipline, practiced not once, but daily, in the way that a musician practices scales. Not because the scales are the music, but because without them, the music cannot happen. The inner life of Marcus Aurelius was, in this sense, a construction project that never finished. He was always working on it, always finding new cracks, new places where the pressure had gotten in, new mornings where the discipline had to be reassembled from its scattered pieces. This is one of the reasons the Meditations feel so immediate across so many centuries. He was not writing from a position of having solved the problem. He was writing from inside it. By the mid-70s, Marcus had been emperor for more than a decade. He had governed through plague, through sustained frontier war, through the administrative demands of an empire that never paused to let its ruler rest. He had buried children. He had lost colleagues and teachers and people whose presence had made the weight of the role easier to carry. He had watched the world continue to produce, with its usual indifference, exactly the kinds of difficulty he had spent his life preparing to face. And then, in 175, something happened that he had not prepared for. Or not quite. A general named Avidius Cassius, who had served Rome capably and had been trusted with significant military command in the East, declared himself emperor. It was a usurpation, a direct challenge to Marcus's rule, the kind of event that in Roman history had frequently ended in bloody civil war. The circumstances surrounding Cassius's rebellion are not entirely clear from the sources we have. There was a rumor, apparently, that Marcus had died. Whether Cassius genuinely believed this, or whether he used it as a pretext for an ambition that had been building independently, is a question the evidence does not resolve cleanly. What we know is that the rebellion collapsed relatively quickly. Before Marcus could even bring a significant military response to bear, Cassius was killed by his own soldiers. The usurpation lasted only a few months. What Marcus did next was, by the standards of Roman imperial history, almost startling. He was remarkably restrained. He did not order mass executions of those who had supported Cassius. He declined to read the letters and documents seized from Cassius's correspondence that might have revealed which senators or officials had been in contact with him, choosing, he said, not to know. Not to be put in the position of punishing people whose names he would then be unable to forget, he burned the documents unread. This is the kind of detail that stops you. The Emperor of Rome, with a stack of letters in his hands that could tell him exactly who among his court had been willing to support a rival, choosing to burn them rather than read them. Not from weakness, not from an inability to act, but from a considered judgment that knowing would do more harm than good, that vengeance, dressed as justice, would corrode something he was trying to preserve. He travelled east after the rebellion to settle affairs in the provinces that had been affected. He took Faustina with him. It was during this journey that she died, in a small town near the base of a mountain range in what is now Turkey. The details of her death are sparse. She had been in poor health. The journey was long and the conditions difficult. She died, and Marcus arranged for her to be honoured in ways that went well beyond ceremony. He requested that she be deified, formally recognised among the honoured dead in the Roman religious tradition. He named a city after her. He ensured that the funds from a charitable institution she had been associated with, an organisation that supported orphan girls, continued after her death. He wrote about her, in the Meditations only briefly. But the brevity is its own kind of evidence. Some losses are too close to examine at length. Some griefs do not translate into philosophy. They simply remain as a particular weight, a particular silence in the record. He returned to Rome, and then, because the work did not stop, he returned eventually to the north. The campaigns on the Danube resumed in the late 170s. Marcus was in his mid-50s by this point. The years of campaigning had worn on him physically. He was not a robust man by nature. The sources suggest he was lean, prone to chest complaints, careful about what he ate, aware of the fragility of his own health in ways that he managed with the same practical attention he gave to everything else. He followed the advice of his physicians. He was disciplined about sleep, about diet, about the management of a body that he understood to be the instrument through which everything else had to be accomplished. His physician during many of these years was a man named Galen, one of the most significant medical minds of the ancient world. Galen had come to Rome from Pergamon, a city on the western coast of what is now Turkey that was home to a celebrated medical tradition. He had treated gladiators before he treated emperors, which had given him a very direct education in how bodies sustain and recover from damage. His relationship with Marcus was professional, but also, by the surviving accounts, something warmer than purely clinical. Galen respected his patient's intelligence. Marcus, in turn, seems to have trusted Galen in the way that a person trusts someone who is genuinely trying to help them, rather than simply managing their expectations. Galen's presence in this life is a reminder of how much was happening in the Rome of Marcus Aurelius beyond politics and war. It was a city of enormous intellectual energy. Philosophers, physicians, lawyers, poets, engineers, people working at the edges of what is then known, pushing carefully or boldly against the limits of their fields. Marcus moved among these people. He read widely. He engaged with ideas across disciplines. His curiosity was not narrowly philosophical. It extended to the natural world, to the questions of medicine and mathematics, and the practical sciences that his empire required and supported. There is something in this breadth that is worth holding on to. Marcus Aurelius is remembered primarily as a philosopher-emperor, which is accurate, but the philosophy was not separate from everything else. It was woven through a life that was also practical, administrative, military, domestic, medical, legal. He was not a man who thought deeply and acted poorly. He was a man who tried, with varying success, to let the thinking inform the acting, to bring what he understood in the quiet of the morning to bear on the complicated reality of the afternoon. The final campaigns on the Danube, in the late 170s and into the 180s, were intended to push the frontier further north, to establish a more defensible line, perhaps even to create new provinces beyond the river that would provide a buffer against the continued pressure from the tribes. Marcus was working toward a long-term solution, not just a temporary settlement. He believed, it seems, that what had been agreed and then broken and then agreed again would keep breaking unless the underlying situation changed more fundamentally. He was in the middle of this effort when his health began to fail in ways that could not be managed back to stability. The winter of 179 going into 180 was spent on campaign. In the military encampment at a site near the Danube, the cold was serious. The work was unrelenting. And Marcus, who had been carrying a body that needed careful management even in easier circumstances, began to decline. The sources describe him as having been ill for some time before the end. He was losing weight. He was eating very little. He had, by some accounts, already begun to separate himself from ordinary daily life in the way that a person sometimes does when they sense, without necessarily naming it directly, that time is running low. He continued to work. He continued to receive reports, to issue decisions, to manage the affairs that came to him. He did not stop until he could not continue. There is a quality to this that feels consistent with everything we know of him. The man who wrote about getting out of bed in the cold morning because duty required it, who wrote about not allowing physical discomfort to become an excuse for abandoning what needed to be done. That man did not take to his bed before the bed finally required him. He had been thinking, for decades, about death, not with morbidity, with the particular Stoic attention to mortality that treated the awareness of an ending not as something to fear, but as something that could clarify. If everything passes, the pleasure and the pain, the success and the failure, the fame and the obscurity, then what remains worth doing? What actions, what choices, what qualities of attention survive the reduction to what is actually important? He wrote about death the way he wrote about everything else that made life difficult, steadily, without flinching, but also without dramatizing. He wrote that to fear death was to misunderstand it, that it was simply a natural process, the same nature that produced everything else, returning what it had lent. He wrote that the people who had come before, the emperors, the generals, the philosophers, the artists, had all gone the same way, and that this was not a diminishment of life, but a clarification of what life actually was. Whether those words comforted him in the difficult final months is something no one can say. Words written in the abstract light of philosophical reflection sometimes feel very different when the thing they describe is no longer abstract. What we can say is that he had spent decades preparing himself as genuinely and seriously as a person can prepare for exactly what was now arriving. He was 58 years old. He had been emperor for nearly 19 years. He had governed an empire through plague and war and usurpation, and the daily, grinding, uncelebrated work of keeping an enormous human system functioning with something close to fairness and reason. He was still on the Danube frontier when the end came, still working. In the final days, Marcus asked to see his son. Commodus had been with him on campaign, as was expected of the co-emperor, the designated heir, the young man who would carry forward everything his father had spent nearly 2 decades building. He came. They spoke. What passed between them in those conversations is not recorded in any source we can fully trust. The ancient writers who covered this period were writing after Commodus's reign had already revealed itself to be what it was, and the accounts they left tend to be shaped by that knowledge. The shadow of what came after falling back across the scene of the father and son together at the end. What we can say, with reasonable confidence, is that Marcus spoke to those around him about the continuity of the work, about the empire, about what needed attention. He was, by the accounts that survive, calm, not performing calm, not the studied stillness of a man trying to appear unafraid, but the quieter version, the calm of someone who had been practicing for this, in one form or another, for most of his adult life. He asked at some point near the end that the friends and advisors who had gathered around him go and give their attention to his son rather than to him. The transition needed to begin. The work needed to continue. He was already, in his own mind, releasing his grip on it, stepping back from the machinery he had tended so carefully, trusting, or trying to trust, that it would hold. He died in March of the year 180. The exact location is given differently in different sources, somewhere along the Danube frontier, in the military setting that had come to define his later years. He was 58 years old. By Roman standards of the time, this was not a young death, but it was not the long old age of a man who had lived without difficulty. The years of campaigning, of illness carefully managed but never fully resolved, of carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from responsibility held at scale for a very long time, had worn on him. He had not been spared. The news travelled from the frontier to Rome with the speed that imperial communications allowed, which was faster than almost anything else in the ancient world, but still measured in days. The city received the news of his death, and according to the sources, mourned, not with the performed grief of a population responding to political necessity, something quieter, more genuine, Marcus had not been a spectacular emperor in the ways that people found easy to celebrate. He had not won sweeping military victories, had not built monuments of outrageous scale, had not distributed largesse in the forms most immediately felt. He had governed, carefully, steadily, with a kind of attention to ordinary fairness that people do not always recognize until it is gone. His body was returned to Rome. He was deified, as emperors generally were, formally enrolled among the honored dead, given temples and observances. His image appeared on coins. His name was added to the long list of imperial predecessors that future emperors would invoke when they wanted to situate themselves within the tradition of legitimate rule. And then Commodus began to govern, and the difference became apparent very quickly. It would be too simple to say that everything Marcus built collapsed immediately. The institutions of the Roman Empire were more durable than any single reign, and the machinery Marcus had tended continued to function in many of its parts for some time after his death. But the tone changed. The quality of attention at the center changed. The careful, deliberate, unglamorous seriousness that Marcus had brought to every decision, the long hours in court, the considered legal rulings, the diplomatic patience with frontier tribes, the reluctance to spend lives on campaigns that could be avoided. All of that required someone at the center who shared the underlying commitment. Commodus did not share it. He was interested in other things, in spectacle, in the performance of power rather than its use. He famously entered the arena himself, dressed as a gladiator, fighting against opponents who were carefully managed to ensure the emperor's victory, and had himself depicted in official imagery as Hercules, the divine hero. He renamed Rome after himself. He renamed the months of the year after himself. He surrounded himself with flatterers and removed or executed those who tried to offer honest counsel. He was assassinated in 192, after a reign of 12 years, by members of his own household who had concluded that the situation had become untenable. History has used Commodus, in part, as a way of reflecting on Marcus. The contrast is almost too neat to be entirely fair. Commodus was a human being of his own complexity, shaped by forces that included, but were not limited to, his father's influence. A childhood spent in the imperial household, with all of its pressures and exposures and absences, is not a straightforward thing to grow up inside. And Marcus himself, as we have seen, made choices regarding his son's succession that the evidence does not entirely explain. But the contrast, even if it is not entirely fair, does illuminate something real. The qualities that Marcus spent his life cultivating, the self-examination, the restraint, the willingness to be corrected, the daily return to what actually mattered, were not automatic. They were not guaranteed by birth or position. They were chosen and practiced and maintained with effort over a very long time. When the choosing stopped, when the practice was abandoned, when the effort was replaced by something easier and more self-gratifying, the results were visible, quickly. This is perhaps one of the quieter lessons this life leaves behind. Not the inspiring version, the philosopher king who proved that wisdom and power can coexist, but the more complicated one, that the philosopher king was always an effort, always a daily decision, always something that could have gone differently, that nearly went differently, on many mornings when the cold was sharp and the bed was warm, and the temptation to let things slide was present and real. The journal is the record of that effort, not the result, the ongoing attempt. After Marcus's death, after the years of Commodus, after the complex and often violent history of the empire that followed, the meditations survived. This is, when you think about it carefully, quite remarkable. A private document, never intended for publication, written in a language, Greek, that was not the language of Roman power and administration, kept through the collapse of the Western Empire, through the medieval centuries, through the transmission and loss and partial recovery of ancient texts that characterizes so much of what we have from the classical world. It survived. The earliest clear reference to the Meditations as a text that was being read and copied dates to several centuries after Marcus's death. It was preserved, apparently, in the Eastern Roman world, the Greek-speaking half of the empire that would survive, in various forms, for more than 1,000 years after the West had fragmented. Someone, at some point, had a copy. Someone else copied it. The chain of transmission is not fully traceable, but it held. By the Renaissance, the text was being read by scholars in Western Europe who were rediscovering classical literature with something close to reverence. It was printed, translated, discussed. Figures across subsequent centuries, rulers, soldiers, philosophers, writers, ordinary people seeking some purchase on the difficulty of their own lives, found their way to it. Frederick the Great of Prussia read it. John Stuart Mill read it. Matthew Arnold wrote about it. In more recent times, figures as different from each other as Nelson Mandela, who read the Meditations during his years of imprisonment, and various leaders and thinkers across different traditions, have cited it as something that helped them. What is it that keeps reaching people across such different centuries and circumstances? Part of the answer is the honesty. Marcus does not present himself as someone who has solved anything. He presents himself as someone trying. The distance between the ideal and the actual, which is where most human lives are lived, is exactly the territory his journal occupies. He is not above the difficulty he describes. He is inside it, writing from inside it, trying to find his way through it one morning at a time. Part of the answer is also the particular quality of the problems he is wrestling with, which turn out to be less specific to his time and circumstance than they might initially appear. How do you remain patient with people who frustrate you? How do you hold your sense of self together when external circumstances are pulling at it from every direction? How do you keep sight of what matters when the noise of what merely demands attention is so constant and so loud? These are not uniquely imperial problems. They are not uniquely Roman problems. They are the problems of being a conscious person in a world that was not designed to make consciousness comfortable. And part of the answer, perhaps, is simply this: that there is something consoling in the knowledge that a person who carried as much as Marcus Aurelius carried, the empire, the frontier, the plague, the grief, the daily weight of decisions that affected millions, found it necessary to write himself small reminders in the evening, to tell himself to be patient, to try again tomorrow, to treat the difficult person in front of him as a fellow human being rather than an obstacle, to remember that the moment would pass and that what remained was how he had chosen to move through it. If that was the work of his life, not the campaigns, not the administration, not the legal rulings, though all of those were real and mattered, but the quieter, private, daily work of trying to be more reasonable and more decent and more present than the day before. Then the meditations are exactly what that work looks like from the inside. They are, in the end, a very human document, written by a man who had everything the world considers worth having, and who spent his evenings quietly noting that none of it was the point. There is a particular kind of legacy that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive in the form of a conquered territory, or a monument that can be seen from a distance, or a name attached to an era. It arrives instead in small moments of recognition. A person sitting alone, in whatever century they happen to occupy, reads a sentence written by someone who died almost 2,000 years ago, and feels, with a quiet surprise that never quite becomes ordinary, no matter how many times it happens, that the sentence is describing something they themselves have felt, something they thought was private, something they thought was perhaps a sign of weakness or failure, or the particular inadequacy of their own character. And then they discover that the man who wrote the sentence was an emperor, that he commanded armies and issued judgments and managed the governance of millions of people, and that he still needed to remind himself, in writing, to be patient, to get up in the morning, to treat the person in front of him with genuine attention rather than the efficient performance of attention, to remember that he would die, and that this was not a cause for grief, but a reason to focus on what actually mattered while there was still time. That moment of recognition is the legacy of Marcus Aurelius, not Rome, not the Danube campaigns, not the legal rulings, which were real and careful and consequential in their time. The legacy is the journal, and what the journal keeps doing to people across centuries. He lived in a world that is, in its external surfaces, almost entirely unlike the one we occupy. The city he governed, with its columns and its aqueducts, and its public rituals, and its slaves, and its extraordinary violence, sitting just below the level of its extraordinary civilization. That world is genuinely far from us. The assumptions it rested on, about power and hierarchy, and the natural order of things, are not our assumptions. Reading about it requires a particular kind of generous attention, a willingness to enter a world on its own terms before judging it by ours. And yet, within that world, one man sat down in the evenings, in rooms lit by oil lamps, in military tents with the cold coming through the canvas, and wrote about the difficulty of being a person who was trying. And those words have not stopped being read, have not stopped being useful, have not stopped arriving in their quiet way at exactly the moment a reader needed something like them. This is not nothing. In fact, it may be the most durable thing a person can leave behind. Not the structure, which the centuries will eventually unmake, not the reputation, which the centuries will eventually complicate, but the words, when the words are honest enough and specific enough and rooted deeply enough in something genuinely experienced rather than performed, those can last. Marcus Aurelius understood this in his own way, though not quite in the way we mean it. He wrote in the Meditations about the impermanence of fame, about how quickly even the most celebrated names are forgotten. He listed emperors who had seemed in their time permanent and towering, and noted that they were already half obscured by the passage of time. He used this observation not to encourage ambition, look what the ambitious built and where it is now, but to encourage clarity. If the fame will fade, then fame is not the thing worth pursuing. What remains worth pursuing is the quality of your attention in the present moment to the life you have actually been given. He did not know his own journal would survive. He did not write it hoping it would. He wrote it because he needed to, because the practice of setting down his thoughts, of articulating clearly what he believed and where he had fallen short of it, and what he intended to try again tomorrow, was itself the point. The writing was not a record of his philosophy. It was the philosophy in action, the practice made visible. That distinction matters. There are plenty of people in history who wrote beautifully about virtue, while living in ways that bore little relationship to what they wrote. Marcus was not without his own contradictions. No honest examination of his life can pretend otherwise. The decision about Commodus, the continuation of wars he might have ended differently, the maintenance of an institution, slavery, that his own philosophical principles, followed to their conclusion, would have had to condemn. He was a man of his time in ways that his philosophy could not entirely free him from, and he was a man with limited vision, as all people are, in ways he could not see clearly from inside his own life. But the gap between what he professed and what he practiced was narrower, in the evidence we have, than it is for most people who have held comparable power. He tried. He kept trying. He documented the trying, honestly, without flattering himself. And when he fell short, which he did, as everyone does, he did not rationalize it. He noted it and recommitted and tried again the next morning. That is, in the end, the most human thing about him. Not the philosophy, though the philosophy is remarkable. Not the power, though the power was real. But the trying, the ordinary, undramatic, daily effort of a person who had decided what kind of person they wanted to be, and then had to live inside that decision every day for decades, in circumstances that made it genuinely difficult, without ever arriving at a point where the difficulty resolved itself into ease. He was fond, in the Meditations, of a particular kind of observation about nature. He wrote about how a fire makes use of everything thrown into it, how obstacles become fuel. He wrote about how a river moves around the stone rather than stopping. He wrote about how the vine produces fruit in season without demanding recognition for it, and then is quiet, and then produces again. These images were not decorative. They were arguments. This is how a person should be, not demanding, not stopped by resistance, producing what you are capable of producing, in season, without needing the world to applaud the production. There is a kind of peace in that image, if you can inhabit it. The vine does not know it is a vine. But Marcus knew he was a person, and the distance between knowing and living accordingly was the distance he was always trying to cross. Writing about the vine was a way of reminding himself what the crossing looked like, in a form that made it seem possible. Ordinary. The kind of thing a living thing simply does. He spent his last years cold and tired and working. He spent his evenings writing. He died near a river, in a tent, with his work unfinished, as all work finally is. And then, slowly, through the uncertain channels of manuscript transmission, through the dedication of unknown copyists in unknown rooms, through the interest of scholars who recognize something worth preserving, His words made their way across the centuries to here, to a person reading in whatever room they are in tonight, in whatever city, in whatever country, in whatever particular version of a difficult life they happen to be living. The words arrived, and they are still doing what they were written to do, even though they were never written for us. They are still saying, this is hard. It is hard for everyone. You are allowed to find it hard. And tomorrow morning, when the difficulty is still there, you can try again. There is something deeply settling in that, not because it solves anything, but because it is honest, because it comes from a person who had every reason to pretend that difficulty was beneath him and chose instead to write it down, to admit it, to make of the admission a practice, and of the practice a life. Marcus Aurelius died in the year 180. He was 58 years old. He had been emperor for 19 years. He had tried, through all of it, to be better than the day before. He had not always succeeded. He had never stopped trying. The Danube is still there, cold in winter, wide and slow, moving through a landscape that has changed almost beyond recognition from the world he knew. The river does not know his name. It does not know any name. It moves because that is what rivers do, in season, without requiring recognition. He would have found something right about that. The journal he kept was never meant to be found. But it was, and it has been traveling ever since, from hand to hand and century to century, finding its way to the particular person who needed it in that particular moment. It found its way to you, perhaps, in one form or another, or perhaps it will, one day. Perhaps something in tonight's telling of it will remain with you, quietly, in the way that things sometimes do. Not as a clear thought, not as something you can articulate the next morning, but as a feeling, a small shift in how you hold the difficulty, a very slight loosening of the grip. That would be, in its modest way, exactly what he intended. Not for us, but for himself. And it turns out, as the most honest things tend to, that what was written for one person can find its way to many. Rest well tonight. And if there is a life you would like to spend a quiet evening with next, a name from history that you have always wanted to understand more fully, or perhaps one you have never encountered but feel drawn toward, you are welcome to leave it below. These stories are here whenever you need them. For now, let this one rest. Good night.